Right. There's new information from a now long deceased loyalist terrorist called Charlie Simpson, who was an extremely close friend of Robin the Jackal Jackson, and he learned an awful lot about Jackson's career, and Jackson told him an awful lot about the Dublin bombings, and this confirms research that's been carried out by others for decades, people like Joe Tiernan, Don Mullen, people like that. But this is yet another layer of confirmation, but it's coming from one of the best friends of Robin Jackson, and I think that's its importance. And what he said in a statement was as follows. I may as well just read it now. It's up on the story I've done recently. He 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 was explaining to his friend Jackson was explaining to his friend Simpson the following, and he said that the UVF in Belfast had been provided with pre-made explosive devices, and scout cars were used to get the cars with the Dublin Monaghan bombings on board safely delivered. The British did not organise the bombing, but they supplied the equipment. Jackson, that's the jackal, mentioned people at Mahon Road Army Base in Portadown. He used the nicknames of these people. So that's confirmation that the Dublin bombings were carried out with the puppet masters pulling the strings in the background being British military intelligence and the wider British intelligence community in Northern Ireland at the time.
Okay, so where does this information come from, given he's deceased?
He gave a very lengthy statement to Chris Moore, the journalist of the BBC, who's a friend of mine, and Chris is doing a book on Kincora, and he was doing research and has been doing research for decades into Kincora. Simpson was a member of Tara. That's the terrorist organization that was led by William McGrath, the housefather at Kincora. He gave an extensive interview about Tara and other related matters, and there were a few comments in the Dublin bombings. Chris knew I was interested in it, and Chris gave them to me. That's the provenance of it.
Interesting. On the note,
yeah, it's a 4-page document. I'd say in the story I've just put up on the Covert History website, I'd say I actually quote 2/3, if not 3/4 of it. So all pretty much all the new stuff is out there.
okay, so what we're going to discuss and much more is, of course, in this recent ebook that you published, and we'll put a link to it in the podcast and the YouTube, yeah, for anyone to read it. Okay, yeah. If anyone if anyone does have any sort of doubts as to whether the British intelligence service would be low enough and devious enough to do something like to be involved in Dublin Monaghan bombing, all you need to do is look at the evidence about Kincora, because I think if you're willing to let mass pedophilia go on, then I don't see what could be lower than that in terms of what you're willing to
do. And these are the same people in the same locality at the same time. So, but another way of looking at it is a book, an official book with the full cooperation of MI6 was published about 10 years ago. And in that they acknowledged that they were blowing up, MI6 were blowing up ships carrying Holocaust survivors away from Europe to Palestine at the time. Imagine you survive Auschwitz or something, and you're trying to get away, and these guys were coming around and blowing up the boats. Most of the boats were blown up in the harbors. There's a rumor that maybe one of them was blown up at sea, but I don't pay an awful lot of credence to that. I don't think anyone's ever proven it, and I think it's such a big thing that it would have been proven by now. But the British Secret Service gave their files to a professor from Queen's University who produced this in a book. So if you're capable of blowing up ships that are going to carry Belsen, Treblinka, Auschwitz survivors, you're capable of doing anything. And I think that's part of the problem in Ireland, was that you had people who were blooded during the Second World War, which was a vicious fight. Now, the enemy were the Nazis, so I don't get carried away in criticizing them, but nonetheless, they were blooded. An awful lot of these guys then stayed in the British Army. I'm talking about the covert people, the intelligence people, the counterinsurgency people, and then they were further blooded and were continually blooding new people in the colonies, in Malaya, Kenya, and Aden, particularly very close to the timeline with Northern Ireland. So by the time these people came to Ireland, they had completely lost their moral compass, and no holds were barred. No holds were barred. Can I just say, I make a bit of a palaver in one of the sections in the ebook where I kind of stress that these guys were secret servants, that they worked in the clandestine world, and that the British government uses things like D notices to cover them up. Now, the reason, and the only reason I put that in, is because I really feel it's unfair to the people of Britain, many of whom I know, have loads and loads of British friends, and they're absolutely fine people. This is all done behind their backs. So criticism of these people is not an endorsement of the IRA. Some idiots try to equate it with. It's not an attack on Britain. It's just these people were criminals operating deep in the shadows, so knowledgeable and aware of what they were doing that they had to cover it up from their own people, who would have been outraged if they'd found out.
Actually, on the note, we'll talk about the events of the actual of the day itself. But on the note about the explosive, which Simpson said was provided them by like proper professionals, the army. The UVF were kind of known. In fact, I spoke to a bomb disposal guy, and he said that the UVF were kind of known as not being as good with their bomb, being competent with their bombs. And it's worth mentioning that all four bombs detonated that day, went off completely, like flawlessly. They were competent bombs. During the Miami show bomb massacre, a few of them blew themselves up trying to put the bomb in the back of
the static in one of the speakers may have set that off. The McGurk's bombing is good comparison. In the McGurk's bomb, they pulled up outside McGurk's bar, having been waiting outside another bar, which we all believe was the original target. And small kid was down the road and saw the guys get out, and he had the bomb, and it was lit with a fuse. So he drops the bomb, fuse is lighting, the kid way down the road, it's nighttime, he can see it, and then they all run away. So that's the type of sophistication that they had only a year or two or three before this. Now, the bombs on this occasion, there were 3 in Dublin, 1 in Monaghan. They were all in suitcases, and they all had timing devices. A guy called Billy Hanna triggered the timing devices at the Coachman Inn, North Dublin. And if you were to look at a map of Dublin, and if you were to get the areas where these bombs went, and if you were to draw a line down the middle, all the bombs are to one side, if you like, of that line. And this was part of the sophistication. This was identified by Colonel John Morgan of the Irish Army Military Intelligence. He wrote a book about the bombings as well. If you look at this line, these guys were able to park, and then they were able to move to the west, where they would have been picked up. So you have you don't just have sophisticated time-lapse devices, which were not typical, despite what David Irvine and others in the UVF say. They were not sophisticated bomb makers, the UVF. This was highly sophisticated. The maneuver of it, as I've described, the escape route for these guys when they left, quite sophisticated and not typical of the UVF. Does that mean that it's absolutely impossible that they couldn't have done it? Anything is possible, but it was not typical of them, and it was typical of a military mind. And Colonel Morgan really brought that out. And that's his. He sadly passed away now. I knew him well. He was a lovely man, but that's his contribution, I think, or one of his major contributions to it, to identify the military fingerprints in this. A lot of people approach the Dublin bombings from the outsides, and then they try to move in. I think there's enough evidence there now that justifies someone like me simplifying it and laying out what I think happened, starting, if you like, at the center of this. And I've already touched upon the idea of these guys who were blooded in the colonies. And of course, the most infamous of them all is Kitson. We've discussed Kitson before at length. And Kitson brought collusion to Ireland. It was standard practice. I quote from the SAS manual in the ebook as well. It was absolutely normal. You go in, you find the enemy's enemy, and you use them to take out people. Now, in Belfast, we have an inkling of very early 1970s who they were recruiting and who they were using. Albert Ginger Baker was one of them. I have spoken to somebody who actually had his reports in his hand, not Fred Holroyd, not Colin Wallace, another guy altogether, confirmed to me that his code name was Agent Broccoli. So there's absolutely no doubt that Albert Ginger Baker, notorious murderer, he's in the story, was colluding, but he was in Belfast. Now, in rural Armagh, they developed another gang, and it was led by a guy called Billy Hanna, not to be mixed up with Jim Hanna, different guys. Billy Hanna was in his 40s. He was a former British soldier, which made him an ideal candidate for this. And by all accounts, an excellent soldier. He had received all types of gallantry, commendations, awards, that type of thing.
In the Korean War, actually, I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah, Korean War, and I'm by no means an expert on the Korean War, but I know quite a lot of ugly things happened during it. Maybe at some stage, someone who knows about what Hanna did, what his troops did in Korea might come forward. It might be quite innocent. He could have been just fighting on the front lines. So let's not speculate about that. But Hanna was the contact between the Kitson type soldiers. Now, of course, Kitson left Ireland in April of 1972, but he left behind he left behind the blueprint which was followed. So loads of people, and Joe Tiernan is the absolute expert on this because he's spoken to them. Joe Tiernan, who actually he's the author of this book here, Dublin Bombings, excellent book. He spoke to loads and loads of people. He's written in McGill magazine and Sunday Independent, and he was, of course, the researcher for the massive documentary on Yorkshire television a couple of decades ago. He spoke to loads of these people, and what he discovered was that Hanna was meeting with guys on a very regular basis. They were coming down, they were meeting him, they were taking him out fishing near Banbridge where he lived. But very crucially, there was a kind of a choke point here. You have these British intelligence guys coming down from Belfast or from Lisburn, meeting with Hanna, but nobody else. They were keeping all of Hanna's associates and people pretty much away. Now, loads of the people around Hanna were British agents as well. But for this specific operation and for other operations as well, Hanna was the only one that they communicated with. Now, that's very relevant because guess what happens about a year after the Dublin bombings are done and dusted? Another British agent, the Jackal, comes along and pops his boss, shoots and murders Hanna. The significance of that then is that whilst loads of people may know what was going on in the court of law, it's hearsay. Something they heard said, not direct evidence. So this is a pattern that is becoming increasingly evident when we discover more and more people who were British agents, that once the military intelligence people have got what they want from you, you're eliminated. And yeah, bye-bye. I mean, there's loads of them. John McCaig is another one. Billy Wright, King Rat, another one. And then there's a lot of people who seem to be dying very young from all types of ailments in their 40s. And I'm a little bit suspicious about that. But anyway, Hanna is organizing this bombing in early 1974. Now, that's important because that's before the change of government, before Harold Wilson returns. So when it appears that this thing is starting, Heath, the Tory party, they're still in charge. One of the really crucial things I stumbled across in one of Kitson's books, he wrote many books, was when he was describing an operation he wanted to run in the Oman. And the amount of reviewing by the Ministry of Defense that took place really astonished me. I was astonished at the absolute control within that massive building where they were working. And it indicated to me that these type of counterinsurgency plots and operations are looked at and vetted at a very high level. And it is inconceivable to me that military intelligence officers could possibly have organized an attack on the next door neighbor to London, Dublin, without getting permission from on high. And Heath was very close to some of these intelligence people. There was a committee he had called Gen 42, I think simply because it was in room 42 in Whitehall, in the Cabinet Office or somewhere like that. And he basically gave them a free rein. I don't think he was hands-on about everything. I don't think he knew, and he certainly wasn't getting into the nitty-gritty detail. For God's sake, he was the Prime Minister. He was a very busy man. But he would have, I believe he would have known in broad outline what was going on. And that's what I mean by starting at the center. Starting at the center. This wasn't two or three wild, out of control fellas out there. Now, it is significant that Harold Wilson, who would not have, in my view anyway, would certainly not have countenanced anything like this. He, by a whisker, won the February 1974 general election, and intelligence services' reaction to that was to start plotting against him. And I think that's a very important part of this story. We'll come to it maybe in a moment. But so let's trace back. So you have the Power Authority in London, you have the Ministry of Defence, and then you have these intelligence officers. You have them following the policies they've developed and the strategies they've developed in the colonies, and you have them now deciding to bomb Dublin. And I believe the two motives for that. I'll come to them in just a moment. And the bombs were executed. We've already touched upon that. On the day, 3 cars were hijacked in Belfast by Willie Frenchy Marchand and others. And they were then driven down to Portadown, where they were then transported to the coachman inn outside Dublin. The Jackal collected the bombs from Glenanne, from Mitchell's farm at Glenanne. There were 3 of them in that suitcase. 3 bombs went to Dublin. And they were, as I described, then dropped around Dublin with the horrible carnage that ensued. And then, as I said as well, then after that, then there was this massive cover-up, ultimately resulting, I believe, in the death of Billy Hannah. So why did they do it? Well, I think David Irvine, who belatedly came to the notion that peace was better than violence, rather well-known UVF guy, he once said during an interview that from the UVF's perspective, this was a bit like returning the serve. And that's what I've called the ebook, Returning the Serve. In other words, you've put us, you, the people of Ireland, have made our lives miserable. Well, we're going to make your life miserable. It's a very misguided statement. If you look at every single government party, not just in the early 70s, but in the late 70s and the 80s, every single government party, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Labour, and much belatedly the PDs, all of those parties were elected by the Irish public. The overwhelming majority of the Irish public voted for them. And they brought in offences against the state legislation. They financed the police to go after the IRA. They financed operations against the IRA. They spent a fortune on imprisoning the IRA and everything. So I find Irvine's attitude repulsive, disgusting, in fact, that children on the streets of Dublin deserve to be blown up because in his mind, the greater Irish public were somehow supporting the IRA when it's self-evident they weren't. Look at the election results. From the British point of view, before the switch over from Heath to Wilson, I think it was to frighten the Irish people. It was to poison the waters. We've discussed that before. The Kitson idea: if you can't take the fish out with the rod, you poison the water. So if you blow, and did that, there's no doubt that worked. None whatsoever. I mean, the people in the Republic got such a fright and a shock from this. The bombings were in Monaghan as well, of course. That it really, really brought home how violent and ugly it was. It brought home how violent and ugly it was for people living in Northern Ireland on both sides. The community had to put up with this. So I think that was part of the thinking. Another layer of the thinking was a kind of a very, very subtle and undeniable, because they're using the UVF, you see, deniable way of saying to Dublin, make more effort. And if you don't, this type of thing can happen again. And it's a threat, done very, very subtly. And I would not be surprised if behind very, very, very firmly shut doors, heavier hints were given, stating that, look, this is going to happen again. Wouldn't have been done blatantly. It would have been done, well, we're doing our best, but unless you really get your act together, the David Irvines up here are going to see the Irish people as fair game, and we can't stop it.